The sun hung low over the Arizona desert in 1887, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain as Samuel Bennett guided his horse along the banks of the Salt River, his weathered hands gripping the reins with the ease of a man who'd spent 30 years working these lands. Samuel was a rancher, 52 years old, his face lined from decades under the unforgiving sun. His reputation in the territory built on hard work and fair dealing with everyone he met, regardless of their background. He'd bought his small ranch 15 years earlier with money saved from years of breaking horses, and he'd made it his mission to treat the Apache people who lived nearby with the same respect he'd want for himself. The river ran high that afternoon, swollen from recent mountain storms, its waters churning brown and violent as they rushed over rocks and fallen trees, creating a roar that echoed through the canyon walls. Samuel had come to check his fence line along the river's edge when he heard something unusual, a sound that cut through the thunder of the water, a voice calling out in distress. He urged his horse forward, scanning the riverbank, his heart beginning to pound as he spotted a figure in the water, struggling against the current about 50 yards downstream. The person was massive, easily 6 feet tall, fighting to keep their head above water as the river pulled them toward a cluster of jagged rocks that could easily crush a skull or break bones. Samuel didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse into a gallop along the bank, his mind racing through options as he watched the figure being swept closer to the rocks with every passing second. As he drew nearer, he could see it was a woman, an Apache woman with long black hair plastered to her face, her arms flailing as she tried to grab onto anything that might stop her deadly journey downstream. She was built like a warrior, broad-shouldered and powerful, but even her strength was nothing against the river's rage, and Samuel knew she had maybe 30 seconds before she'd be dashed against those rocks. He pulled a rope from his saddle, the same lasso he'd used 1,000 times to catch cattle, formed a loop with hands that moved on pure instinct, and called out to get her attention. The woman's head turned toward him, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, and in that moment Samuel saw past her size and strength to the simple truth: she was someone's daughter, and she was about to die. He swung the rope once, twice, then released it with a prayer, watching the loop sail through the air as the woman reached the point of no return, just 15 feet from the rocks that would end her life. The rope dropped around her shoulders like a blessing, and she grabbed it with both hands, her survival instinct overriding the exhaustion that had been pulling her under just seconds before. Samuel wrapped his end around the saddle horn and backed his horse up the bank, the rope going taut as the river fought to keep its prize, the current creating a terrible tension that made the rope creak and the horse strain. For a moment, Samuel thought the rope might snap or the horse might lose its footing, but slowly, inch by inch, the woman was pulled from the main current into the calmer water near the bank. She half swam, half crawled through the shallows until she collapsed on the sandy shore, coughing up river water, her chest heaving as she gasped for air, alive against all odds. Samuel dismounted and approached carefully, his hands visible and non-threatening, speaking in the few Apache words he'd learned over the years, trying to communicate that she was safe now, that he meant no harm. The woman looked up at him, and he was struck by her eyes, dark and intelligent, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps surprised that a white rancher had risked his life to save hers. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 30, with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. Her clothing, though soaked and torn, was decorated with intricate beadwork that suggested she was no ordinary member of her tribe. Samuel offered her his canteen, which she accepted with a nod, drinking deeply before attempting to speak, her voice rough from swallowing half the river, but steady with an inner strength that commanded attention. She spoke in Apache, then switched to broken English, explaining that her horse had spooked while crossing the river, throwing her into the water where the current had immediately taken control, dragging her downstream faster than she could swim. Her name was Nage, she told him, and her father was someone important in the tribe, though she didn't elaborate. She seemed more focused on the fact that a white man had saved her when most would have ridden past. Samuel helped her to her feet. Amazed at her height, she stood nearly eye to eye with him, and her handshake when she offered it had the grip of someone who could probably break his arm if she chose to. He offered to ride her back to her people, but she insisted she could walk, her pride clearly wounded more than her body, though Samuel noticed she was limping slightly from where her leg had struck something in the river. They compromised. Samuel would ride slowly alongside her to make sure she made it safely to the boundary of Apache land, about 2 miles upstream, where her people had a settlement near the canyon walls. As they traveled, Nate spoke more freely, telling him about her life, how she'd grown up the tallest girl in the tribe, how she'd learned to fight and hunt alongside the men, earning respect through skill rather than waiting for it to be given. She asked Samuel about his ranch, about his life, and seemed genuinely interested when he talked about his philosophy of treating all people with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. When they reached the boundary of Apache land, Nate paused and turned to face him, her expression serious as she placed her hand over her heart in what Samuel understood to be a gesture of deep respect and gratitude. She spoke in Apache, words that Samuel didn't fully understand but whose meaning was clear in her tone. She was in his debt, and among her people, such a debt was not taken lightly or forgotten easily. Samuel waved off her thanks, explaining through gestures and his limited Apache vocabulary that any decent person would have done the same, that her life had value simply because she was human, nothing more complicated than that. Nate smiled at this, an expression that transformed her fierce features into something warm and approachable, and she told him in careful English that her father would want to meet him to thank him properly for saving his daughter's life. Samuel nodded politely but didn't think much of it as he rode back to his ranch, assuming that perhaps some tribal elder might stop by with a small gift, maybe some jerky or a woven blanket as a token of appreciation. He spent the rest of the evening tending to his cattle and fixing a section of fence, the incident with Nate already becoming just another story in a life filled with them, notable but not life-changing, or so he thought. The next morning Samuel was in his barn mending tack when he heard the sound of many horses approaching, not the casual pace of a few riders but the deliberate rhythm of an organized group moving with purpose. He stepped out into the morning sun and felt his breath catch in his throat. Riding toward his small ranch house was a party of at least 30 Apache warriors, all armed, all mounted on impressive horses, and all focused directly on him. At the head of this intimidating group rode a man who could only be described as magnificent, perhaps 60 years old but sitting his horse like a young warrior, his bearing radiating authority and power in a way that made Samuel instinctively straighten his spine. The man wore the regalia of a chief, his clothing decorated with silver and turquoise, eagle feathers in his long gray hair, and around his neck hung a medallion that Samuel recognized as a symbol of tremendous importance in Apache culture. Beside him rode Nate, looking completely recovered from her ordeal, sitting tall and proud on a beautiful paint horse, her eyes meeting Samuel's with an expression that seemed to say, "I tried to warn you this would happen." The group came to a halt 20 feet from Samuel's porch, and the silence that followed was so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, wondering if perhaps he'd made some terrible cultural mistake the day before. The chief dismounted with fluid grace and walked forward, and Samuel noticed that every warrior in the group was watching this interaction with intense interest, as if what happened next would be discussed around campfires for years to come. The chief stopped directly in front of Samuel and studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's character, judging not just his actions but the intentions behind them, weighing his soul with the wisdom of decades of leadership. Then the chief spoke, his English perfect and unaccented. Educated in a mission school decades earlier, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he introduced himself as Chief Cochise the Younger, named for his famous grandfather, leader of 400 Apache people in the territory. Samuel felt his knees go slightly weak. He'd saved the daughter of one of the most powerful Apache leaders in Arizona, a man whose goodwill or enmity could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster for any rancher in the region. Chief Cochise explained that Nate was not just his daughter, but his youngest child and favorite, the one who reminded him most of his own youth, fierce and proud and unwilling to accept limitations others tried to place on her because of her gender. He said that when Nate had returned home the previous evening and told him how a white rancher had risked his life to save her without hesitation, without asking who she was or what reward he might receive, he had barely believed it. In a time when many white settlers viewed Apache people as obstacles to be removed or threats to be eliminated, the chief said, a man who saw only a human life in danger was rare enough to be treasured like water in the desert. Chief Cochise turned and gestured to his warriors, and Samuel watched in amazement as they began to unload items from their pack horses, laying them out on the ground in front of his porch with ceremonial care and precision. There were blankets woven with intricate patterns that would take months to create, jewelry set with turquoise and silver worth a small fortune, dried meat and prepared foods that represented weeks of work, all gifts of tremendous value in Apache culture. But the chief wasn't finished. He explained that among his people, a life debt required more than material gifts. It required a bond of friendship and alliance that would extend to Samuel's descendants and the chief's own family for generations to come. He announced that from this day forward, Samuel Bennett would be considered a friend of the Apache, that he and his property would be under the protection of Cochise's people, and that any Apache who brought harm to Samuel would answer to the chief himself. More than that, the chief said, he was granting Samuel grazing rights to an additional 2,000 acres of land adjacent to his current ranch, land that belonged to the tribe but would now be available to Samuel for as long as he lived, ensuring his cattle business could expand and thrive. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes, not from the material value of the gifts, though that was substantial, but from the recognition that in saving one life without thought of reward, he'd somehow earned the respect and friendship of an entire people. Chief Cochise stepped forward and placed both hands on Samuel's shoulders, speaking in Apache words that Nate translated. He was saying that Samuel had proven that the divide between their peoples was not as wide as hatred and fear made it seem, that good men existed in all tribes and all colors. The ceremony concluded with Samuel being presented with an eagle feather, an honor rarely given to outsiders, symbolizing courage and integrity, a recognition that would be understood and respected by Apache people throughout the territory. As the warriors began to remount their horses, Nate approached Samuel one last time, telling him that she hoped they would meet again under happier circumstances, perhaps when he needed help with a particularly stubborn horse or wanted to learn more Apache words than the few he currently knew. Samuel thanked her and her father, his voice thick with emotion, explaining that he'd only done what any decent human being should do, but he was deeply honored by their generosity and would strive to be worthy of the trust they'd placed in him. Chief Cochise smiled, an expression that softened his weathered face, and replied that it was precisely because Samuel saw his actions as nothing special that he was the exact kind of man worthy of such trust and friendship. The Apache party rode away, leaving Samuel standing in front of his small ranch house, surrounded by gifts worth more than his property, but more importantly, possessing something that couldn't be bought at any price, the genuine friendship and respect of people he'd been taught to fear. In the years that followed, Samuel's ranch prospered beyond his dreams, the additional grazing land allowing him to expand his herd, and the protection of the Apache ensuring that his cattle were never stolen and his property never threatened by the conflicts that plague other settlers. More valuable than any material gain was the relationship that developed between Samuel and Chief Cochise's people, He learned their language and customs, they taught him tracking and survival skills, and a genuine mutual respect grew from that day by the river. Nate became a frequent visitor to Samuel's ranch, often bringing her own children in later years to meet the man who'd saved their mother's life, teaching them that character and courage could be found in unexpected places and unexpected people. Samuel never boasted about what happened, but the story spread throughout the territory anyway, becoming a legend that was told in both Apache camps and settler towns, a reminder that in a time of division and conflict, simple human decency could bridge any divide. On his deathbed many years later, surrounded by friends from both cultures, Samuel said that jumping into that river to save Nate was the easiest decision he'd ever made, because when he saw another human being in danger, nothing else, not race, not history, not fear, had mattered even for a second. The eagle feather given to him by Chief Cochise was buried with him, and at his funeral, Apache warriors and white settlers stood side by side, united in mourning a man who'd proven that seeing the humanity in others costs nothing but can change everything. Retry.